Hey, In2Picklers, week 3 of our podcast. Thanks for joining us. This podcast is called Pickleball Therapy for a reason. We talk about some pickleball concepts and give you some pickleball tips, but at the end of the day, it's really to give you a few minutes of just some pickleball talk that hopefully will help you enjoy the game more and maybe become a better pickleball player. In this week's riff, I'm going to talk about lob coverage and how to cover lobs and some of the issues I see out there when folks go back to cover lobs. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about how you play pickleball that's right for you. A lot of times when we're out there, we're trying to play pickleball in a way, or we may be trying to play pickleball in a way that is right for somebody else, but may not be the right way to play for us, for our person. And so what I want to talk a little bit about that today, and I want to give you some specific examples of that. So stay tuned for the podcast. Are you repeating the same errors on court over and over again? Wouldn't it be nice if you could first recognize what was causing the repeated error, and second, fix it during the game? You can acquire this skill set. You can study videos and watch your friends as they play to develop your ability to see the game. Or you can join the In2Pickle Academy and we will teach you how. If you're interested, go to In2Pickle.com and click on clinics, or you can email Laurie, Laurie, at In2Pickle.com. Become the best player you can be. Last couple of weeks, we've been talking about how to improve as a player. So we gave you some specific tips on how to improve as a player and also some more conceptual things about how to think about improvement, how to work on improvement. What I want to talk about this week is you as a pickleball player. In other words, how do you decide what it is that you as a pickleball player need to focus on in order to, have the most fun and be the most effective pickleball player that you can be on the court? I think it's really important as a pickleball player to find your own identity on the court. It's a mistake, in my opinion, to come out to the court and then try and be a player that you're not. In other words, you'll be out on the courts and you'll see, player John or player Mary or player anybody, and you're going to then try and emulate their style of play. So you're going to say, well, so-and-so, really hits the ball hard, so I want to hit the ball hard. And I'm not saying that hitting the ball hard isn't a goal that you should aspire to if it makes sense, but not because player so-and-so on the court is doing it. It should be something that makes sense because it does. In other words, you look at your game, you look at what you're doing, the strengths and weaknesses in your game, and you figure out that that's something that maybe you need to add to your game, as opposed to, you're just watching some other player and saying, well, they do it, therefore I'm going to do it. If you watch pro players, different players win with different styles, different techniques. Some players are very aggressive, driving every ball, attacking every ball. You can think of the mother-daughter, the Waters, or the father-son, the Sobeks. They're very aggressive players. They just go out there and hammer balls, and they're successful doing it. Then you have other players that have more of a blend of aggression and non-aggression. Think of a player like a Glenn Peterson or a player like Lisa Naumu on the women's side. Players who basically mix up some aggression and some non-aggression in order to accomplish your objective. And so you can craft a game, or you can build a game around a style or an identity that makes sense for you as a person and as a player. The reason I picked this topic is I had a question asked, and I did a video this week about switching hands that really brought it to the forefront. Switching hands is a good example of an area where players, well-intentioned players, will tell other players not to switch hands. They suggest not to switch hands to them because that's not proper technique or not the way it should be played. The game should be played. The reality is that the question whether to switch hands or not is a little more complex at that. The example I gave in the video was a player I met a few months back who was also she was a right-handed player in the sense that she played mostly with the right hand, but she was also a high-level softball player, a really high-level softball player. And if you think about that game in softball, if she's right-handed, so she throws right-handed, that means that she catches the ball with her left hand. That's where her glove is. So, really her left hand is actually more trained, or it has more repetitions catching balls or receiving balls. So it's actually a better hand for some shots like dinks, third shots and things like that, where you're basically trying to toss the ball or throw the ball. You have to catch it first. So you have to catch and throw it. So the left hand would actually be better for that. The right hand's probably better for smashes and hard shots like serves and things like that, because that's the hand that she throws with. So it's going to have a little more strength and a little more accuracy on those types of shots. So, it's a player like that, it doesn't make sense to tell a player like that don't switch hands, because she's perfectly capable of switching hands and it's not going to be detrimental to her game. Now, on the other hand, I can take a brand new player, someone who's never played any sport before in his or her life. I would not train that person or that player to switch hands. That's not something that I would work into the game, because there's so many other things to work on. So it's not something that I would say, hey, let's learn how to switch hands. But that doesn't mean that that's not right for the softball player that's now playing pickleball. So that's an example of an area where your experience, your physical conditioning, all sorts of things can inflect how you play. Another example is, for example, like return to serve. If you're 22 years old and can run Usain Bolt speed 100 meters, then you can return however you want, because you're going to make it up to the non-volley zone line. But if you're 75 years old and say you have a bad knee, then hitting a hard return to serve is probably not the best strategy, because hitting a hard return to serve will mean that you have less time to get up to the MVZ, and that'll detrimentally affect your game, because you're not able to get up to the non-volley zone line and lock down the non-volley zone before the next shot comes in. So that's an example of how physical, your physical condition, your age can influence the type of game you play, and how you have to, you should try and modify the game you play to suit your person. A couple other examples that come to mind are, ready position is an area that players focus on. Some players say you have to hold the paddle, Coach Mo style, so old school style, where you basically have the paddle like at 9 o'clock or 3 o'clock, depending on whether you're left-handed or right-handed, but it's basically where you have the backhand sitting in front of you, like parallel to your body. And that's one form of ready position. Another one is the Sarah Ansbury style, which is basically like a rifle. So you basically hold it at 12 o'clock, no matter whether you're right-handed or left-handed, and you use the paddle as sort of like a rifle sight, and you can kind of move it with the ball. And then there's the 10 o'clock or 2 o'clock, and now the newest one is the 11 o'clock or 1 o'clock. And then the other question is whether you hold it up to your chest or down at your hip. In my view of the game, ready position is something that is whatever is comfortable for you. Clearly, you can make arguments for certain strategies or certain positions better than others. But, spending a lot of time on that really doesn't make a lot of sense. As long as your paddle isn't laying on your side, laying down at your side, not ready at all, that's a situation where, you probably want to put it in a ready position. But once you get into that ready position, which one of those you hold, for most of us, is not going to make a huge difference in our game, whether we hold it in position 1 or position, 10 or whatever. Whichever ready position you want to use is whichever is more comfortable for you. Another example is defending. Some players like to defend from the line. So they get up to the MVZ line and they basically defend it at all costs. That's an option that you can use, but it's something that for other players, like myself included, I like to back up a little bit. I like to take a step back. I like to have a little more time, recognizing my eye-hand coordination is what it is. So I make an adjustment based on that and adjust my play based on my characteristics as a player. So I'm not trying to become Dave Weinbach, for instance, who has really fast eye-hand coordination and can defend from the line pretty successfully most of the time. I don't try and emulate Dave Weinbach in my game. I play a game that makes more sense for my style of play and also for my characteristics as a player. Did your cousin call you and say, "Teach me pickleball"? You can do that, or you can get him a copy of Play Pickleball, the Beginner's Guide. It's the most complete guide on how to play pickleball. It includes how to hit the ball, the rules of the game, scoring, and even some strategy. You can find it at In2Pickle.com or on Amazon. None of this is to suggest that you shouldn't work on your game. In other words, if you have an area that you think you need to add to your game because it makes sense as a player, then certainly I would recommend adding that to your game. In other words, bringing it into your game and working on it. So, for instance, say that your third shot isn't so good, but you're a driver, right? You know how to drive the ball because you came from tennis or something. Or you have a racquetball backhand or something like that, and you want to learn how. You don't really have a third shot drop or a neutralizing shot like that. Obviously, it would make sense from a pickleball standpoint to learn that stroke or to learn that mechanic of that stroke and work on it to improve your game. So in that case, just because you don't have a third shot drop doesn't mean you shouldn't learn one. What I'm suggesting is don't force things or strokes or techniques into your game that aren't necessarily required or important to the game and that don't meld well with your style of play or your personality. One of the beautiful aspects of this game is that it can be played different ways and effectively played different ways. So you can play a more soft game and be very effective. You can play a lob soft game, counter punch sort of game. You can play an aggressive game. So you have different styles that get out on the court. It'd be kind of a boring game if we were just a bunch of robots getting out on the court and everybody executing the exact same approach to the game. Then, it wouldn't be any fun. This game is so varied and it has so many different strategies you can bring to bear. The key is to find the strategy that makes sense for you and your personality and your style of play. One clarification before we leave the subject. There are some areas in pickleball where I think it makes sense to abide by certain tried and true rules. For example, when you return serve, getting up to the non-volley zone line. There really isn't a strategic world or a world in which I think strategically you could say that staying back at the baseline after you return serve is the optimal strategy. So that's an example of an area where you'd want to say, okay, I'm going to strive to accomplish this objective. But again, how you accomplish that objective, that's dependent on your skill set and also how, again, your physical characteristics and how you want to play the game. So for example, say you're stacked and you're not super fast and you have to get across, then you want to hit a higher, deeper return so you have more time to get up to the non-volley zone line and lock it down. Whereas if you're, maybe young and come from tennis and you want to do a spin, hard, return in the corner and you can still make it up to the non-volley zone line, that's fine. The objective of getting up to the non-volley zone line remains the same for both players. How they get to that non-volley zone line is what's different. Understanding that there are some strategic fundamentals that will create optimal pickleball play and working within the constraints of those strategic considerations, find the approach to the game that makes the most sense for you and try and develop that as you become the best pickleball player that you can be. If you're interested in lob coverage and my thoughts on lob coverage and the proper movement for lob coverage, stay tuned for my riff. Did you know that there's a shoe designed specifically for pickleball? Well, there is. We are proud to partner with Tyrol Shoes, the designer of shoes specifically made for pickleball. You can find them at our site, In2Pickle.com, Tyrol Pickleball Shoes, the shoes I wear on court. A student recently related a story to me about a friend of hers who had been playing at the courts where they play at, who had fallen back while heading back to cover a lob or moving backwards towards a lob or to cover a lob, had fallen back and I think broken the wrist or damaged the wrist and actually hit her head too on the court. And so that reminded me of something that I've been meaning to work on for a little bit, which is, not just talk about the proper way of covering a lob, but also talk about a potential rule that I think should be adopted because of the danger involved in that type of motion and the frequency with which it occurs out there. So first, whenever you get a lob going over your head, you should never back up. I'm actually guilty of that. You get in the moment and you start backing up. So you're basically, your body remains parallel to the net. So you don't turn and you just back up 1 foot, 1 foot, 1 foot. And then what happens is if you happen to catch your heel or just stumble a little bit, there's really no way to stop that fall other than putting your hands behind you, which is going to cause could cause significant damage to your arm, elbow, wrist, shoulder, whatever. And also if you don't do that or you don't do it successfully, then you can roll back and smack your head. And so it's a really dangerous way of doing it. The right way of doing it is either turning and pivoting like an overhead in tennis. So basically where you take if you're right-handed, you would take your right leg. If you're left-handed, you take your left leg, and you basically pivot that, or you take that leg back and pivoting on the other leg. So if I'm left-handed, I would pivot on my right leg, take my left leg back. If I'm right-handed, I'd pivot on my left foot, and then take my right leg back, and then basically track it that way. And that way I'm sideways and so I'm basically 90 degrees to the net, my body is, and I can track the ball better, and it's less risk of falling that way. And if I do fall, I can always turn and then catch myself falling forward instead of backwards, which is a lot safer. The other way to cover a lob is, if you need to, is to turn all the way around and go get it. The last option is always available, which is just to congratulate the other team on a nice shot and move on to the next rally. That said, I'm going to suggest, and I'd like to hear your feedback on this. If you see what you think about it, send me an email, Tony@In2Pickle.com, or I think you can comment in the podcast. The rule I'm going to suggest is that we adopt a rule as a sport that basically makes the backward movement without turning a fault. So basically, if the player takes, it's either going to be 2 steps or 3 steps, I got to figure that out, but backwards. So then the other team just calls fault, just like stepping in the NVZ. You just call a fault. The point is over, the rally is over, and then you move on. It has, obviously, a response is going to be, well, what about potential for abuse? Yeah, that could happen. I mean, that's a possibility, just like anything else in pickleball, outballs and things like that. But I think that when you look at the risk that's associated with the move that happens, or the backwards move, that the risk that's associated with that, I think it's fair to balance that against the potential loss of a rally or even a point, I guess, if it's a scoring point opportunity or point scoring opportunity. When you balance those two things, I think it makes sense to implement this kind of a rule, because we need to have a system that dissuades people from moving backwards in the improper way. And the only way that I can come up with is to basically, call it a fault. And then that'll make people more conscientious of that. So anyway, let me know your thoughts on it. There's another way to deal with it. That's awesome. I just think it's something that we need to address. Thanks for listening this week. Let us know what you think. If you like the podcast, please rate us. It helps us reach other listeners on the platform. Also, please share our podcast if you think it's worthwhile. Share it with your friends and family, whoever plays pickleball and needs a little pickleball therapy. Stay safe out there.